All right, everybody. So in this video, we're going to be talking about web fonts and embeddable web fonts. And before web fonts really became popular, the only way we could get really interesting typography and interesting fonts into web pages were either through our text replacement technique, which we used for our logo, which does work and is effective, but it's kind of a brute force way of doing all the copy on an entire site. You wouldn't want all of your copy to be done that way because you would be constantly doing image replacement. And for a lot of sites, the ability to dynamically change and update copy is very important. Think of a blog where every time you had to publish, you had to do image replacement for all of the text. It would just be insane. It would be insanity. So that's not really an option. The other option, we had was just to use different fonts in the font family tag. But here we're only really limited to what our own personal computers handle, what they have locally on their machine, and what are typically thought of as standard fonts. And those are your Helveticas, your Georgias, your Times New Roman, your Arial fonts. All of these are basically standardized because it's safe to assume that they're going to be available on everyone's computers. So, what are we to do if we want to add some interesting typography to a website? Well, there are tons of options. Well, there are not tons of options. There are lots of options for this. And my personal favorite is a service called Typekit. It used to be its own startup, but Adobe acquired it late last year, I believe, or even the year before that. There are also other competing services from Google and Adobe, and there are lots of other ones that also do embeddable web fonts. So do some research, take your pick, find one that you like or one that you don't have to pay for. It all depends on the needs of the particular project. They all pretty much work the same, so I'm going to demo using Typekit because that's what I use on most of my projects. So if we go to our Typekit library, I can see that I have a much wider selection of fonts to choose from, and very nice, interesting fonts from the Adobe Type library, and just generally some great foundries are available for the Typekit library. So I've already created a little Typekit for this site, and I've already added some fonts. So what I've done is I've gone through and I've chosen a couple different fonts that I think would look good in this particular site. I've got kind of a serif font here and a sans serif, a News Gothic standard from Adobe, and then an FFTiza Web Pro from FontFont, which actually looks quite a bit like the Officina sans serif, which I'm currently using in the image replacement header. So the first font I want to place is this FFTiza Web Pro, and we're going to use it in our H group. So we're going to use it in those two white headings. So I just want to click, and what I can do is Typekit gives me a nice font family that I can just copy and paste out of here. And then if we come back over to our H group, I can add that font family. Now, if I don't do anything else here, and I go back to my family recipes and refresh, nothing's going to change. In fact, this is just going to default back to a standard serifed font. So I have to do a few things to make this work. First of all, I have to get my page back up. There we go. First of all, I need to make sure I have all the embed code in the head of my file. So if we grab this script text and bring it over to our HTML page and stick it just below our CSS and hit save, now I should be able to see it. Now I think there's going to be one other problem with this, and you'll notice it's still not showing up. So the way Typekit and some of these other services work is you need to tell it about your URL so that it knows how to respond properly to your request. And right now I'm not sending any URL in my header because I'm just looking at this locally. So what I need to do is fire up a web server locally so that I can look at this content and see my fonts at the same time. So what I'm going to do is hop on over to my terminal, and I've navigate it into my week 8 folder. And what I'm going to use is a very simple web server that is actually built into the Python programming language. And if you're on Mac OS X or Linux and you have Python installed, if you are on Mac OS X, you do have Python installed. If you're on Linux or another system, you may need to get it installed using Windows. I would say it's probably not worth starting this for just this particular demo. I would probably just look at other alternatives or just simply skip this part, because it's probably not worth installing Python simply to run this web server. So if we start this, you can see that it starts serving an HTTP server on port 8000. And if you take my class in the spring on web servers, you will learn a whole lot more about this type of thing. But anyway, we will jump back to Chrome. And then what this allows me to do is now I can go to localhost, which is an actual domain, and this should allow me to view my web fonts, because Adobe, or excuse me, Typekit will see that I'm using a proper domain. So now we actually have a URL up here that can be passed. So you can see here actually that there are my embeddable web fonts, and I can still select my text, and it functions and feels just like any other HTML text, except now I have a really nice looking visual for that, a much better font. So the last thing I want to do is get my News Gothic in here, and I think what we're going to do for this guy is use it basically everywhere else. So in that case, I can just come and we will change the main body font family over to this. And then hopefully when I refresh, there you go. You can see I have an updated main body text as well. So that is how you use embeddable fonts. And just to recap, most of these work by inserting a little bit of JavaScript in the head of your HTML file. And then once you select your fonts from your particular provider, and this is going to change from provider to provider, you basically then have all those fonts at your disposal, and you can just use standard font family calls in your CSS. So it's really great because it's a seamless integration. You don't have to do any hacky stuff in your CSS, and you can just use the new font names just like you would a standardized font. And the results are really great looking web fonts without the overhead of doing text replacement or the usability problems with using non-standard fonts that aren't available on local computers.